Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. My name is Caitlin Goodrow, and I'm the events manager of CFA Society Boston, joined today by Sean Fullerton, representing the CFA Society Boston Women in Investment Management Network. On behalf of the Women's Programming Committee, I'm happy to welcome our speaker, Laura Fay from Bates Communication, for our leadership discussion. Before we kick it off, I would like to introduce you to Kristen Lindstrom from Bates Communication for a few housekeeping comments.
Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give you a very quick tour of your Zoom dashboard so it makes it a little better viewing experience for you today. The first place I'd like you to start is in the center top of your screen. You'll see a little View Options tab with an arrow that drops down. If you could go ahead and click that, and next to side-by-side mode, make sure you have a check mark. The next place I'll have you stop is just to the right of that. You'll see a little tab that at this point either says Speaker View or Gallery View. You can test toggling back and forth. We suggest a Speaker View, and the way you know you're in Speaker View is if it says Gallery View, so it says the opposite of what you'd like. The next place I'll have you stop is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a mute and stop video icon. You want to make sure for the program you are in mute, so there should be a red line through your microphone. And it's fine if you'd like to remain on video, but if you would like to be off video for today's session, just make sure there's a red line through that as well. Going along the bottom toolbar to the right, you'll see a participants icon. If you'd like to click on that, you'll see a place where you could raise your hand by clicking the hand. You can lower your hand again if you've accidentally raised your hand and we haven't called on you. You can lower your hand by clicking on it again. And then I'm going to have you click on the chat icon. You'll use this a couple of ways. You can chat to everyone. If you have a question for the group, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So that's where you put your question to everyone. If you're having any tech issues and you'd like to reach out to me, I can assist with that, and you can just direct it to me. And the last thing I'm going to instruct you on is annotation. We're going to annotate today, and some of you may have not used this feature yet. So if you go to the very top of your screen, where we were earlier, at the View Options, and click the down arrow, you'll see an option for Annotate. If you click that option, you'll bring up a little annotation toolbar. We're going to be using the stamp feature, which is the fourth feature over. And Laura will instruct you to use the star and the X. And we can remind you of that again later, but that is where your annotation bar is. Now, if you'd all like to maybe close that red X on the annotation bar, and we are ready to begin.
Great, well, thank you, Kristen. And also, thank you all for joining on behalf of CFA Boston Women in Investment Management Network. We really appreciate you being here with us today. I'd like to introduce you to Laura Fay. She's a principal and senior consultant at Bates Communications. She's got more than 20 years of experience in leadership roles in the investment management industry, including at Wells Fargo Asset Management, Wachovia, and Scudder Investments. Over her career, she served as the chief advisor to the CEO on external and internal communications. She also oversaw PR as chief media spokesperson. During her career, she spearheaded crisis communications, CEO transition management, M&A announcements. We're really lucky to have her with us today, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I know schedules are really busy. There's a lot going on, and you probably have a lot of video meetings. So making time for another one, I truly appreciate it. So when I first met with the CFA Boston Society several months ago, and we talked about this session, I don't think any of us could have foreseen how the world would change in just a couple subsequent months. And the pandemic was really just unfolding when we started talking. And we really have gotten thrown into this VUCA world. And business leaders are just trying to figure out, how do I manage in a virtual environment? How do I just keep my company afloat? How do I keep serving my clients and keep my employees supported? So fast forward to today, and it doesn't feel like any of that volatility or uncertainty or complexity or ambiguity. For those of you who aren't familiar with the VUCA acronym, that's what it stands for, that has not gone away. And in fact, what really began as a health crisis has really evolved into a social injustice crisis, an economic crisis, and for many executives, a leadership crisis. So we're here for the long haul. So what do you do in this environment? And what do leaders do? What do they need from their teams? What do their teams need from them? And how can we offer the kind of support that isn't just about staying calm, but it's about spreading calm? So my goal today is to share with you a little bit about how Bates defines executive presence. So those qualities or behaviors that are really important during the good times for leaders, but they're kind of non-negotiable during a time of crisis. And I'll offer you some tools that either you can use or you can use them as you're supporting your leaders to really help exude resilience and composure during this extended period of change that we're going through. So we're a relatively small group here, which is great because I really want this to be as engaging and interactive as possible. So I know Kristen alluded to, I'm going to make you do a little bit of work. Hopefully you will be very vocal and we'll be using the chat box a lot. So please, anytime you have a question, a comment, throw it into the chat box or raise your hand, or we'll be using that annotation tool. But the more participation we get, the more interesting and energizing hopefully the session will be. So just to test that out, I would love for you all to just drop into the chat box, what are you hoping to get out of today? Anything that you're hoping to hear, and I'll touch on as many of those things as I can, but I can always follow up afterwards as well if there are things that we don't get to. So why don't you test out that chat box and let me know, what are you hoping to hear covered today? There we go. The stay calm analogy. Excellent. Tips for executive presence on Zoom. Okay. Great. Well, keep those comments coming. Let's, and I'll touch on some of that for sure, keeping the team engaged. There's probably a whole session we could do on virtual Zoom best practices, and there's some things that I can send to the group afterwards that kind of goes through some of the, we have an acronym called FIELD, which is for kind of the things you can do to make sure your virtual presence is as impactful as possible. So I'll try to revisit some of that towards the end, but let's jump in and talk a little bit about this idea of executive presence. So, you know, if you look at this quote, I have another question for you to answer in the chat. For those of you who are trying to grab a bite of lunch, I'm sorry I'm making you work so much, but I would love to know in your companies, or even just in your own words, how do you define executive presence, or how do you hear people talk about executive presence? And when you think about leaders who are influential, what things come to mind for you? Any thoughts? This concept of executive presence, when we talk to clients about it, we sometimes hear things like, well, it's charisma, or it's savvy, or it's gravitas. You know, a lot of that is about perception, and that's what this quote is really getting to. It's, you're not the leader you think you are, you're the leader your people think you are. So perception is about that ability to match your actions to what others need. If you think you're a great leader, that only takes you so far if the people around you don't feel it. But, you know, what is it? What is this idea of executive presence? And, you know, after doing a lot of this work, we found it's actually very hard for people to define, and it's hard to measure, which means it's really hard to work on. So smooth sailing mentality for the team instills confidence, vision, calm, rational, authenticity, empathy, and connection. Some of the things showing up on chat, it's awesome. And we're going to actually touch on a lot of these behaviors. So, you know, when we struggled with, you know, hearing from clients that I really just didn't know how to put my arms around this and improve on it, we did a lot of research. So what we found was that this is the definition that's, you know, rooted in some research, rooted in science, and this is what we work with a lot of our clients on. But we look at it as the qualities of a leader as viewed by others that engage, inspire, align, and move people to act. So a lot of what you're saying in the chat really contributes to this idea of not only how do you connect with folks, how do you get them excited, but how do you get them to also be really productive and move the business forward. So perceptions of others, are their perceptions of our leadership behaviors can really influence the action and what happens. So let's talk about the model a little bit, and I won't spend a ton of time on this, but because it is a research-based scientific model, I want to give you the framework so that a lot of the comments that I share from this point are going to be anchored back to this idea. We call this the Executive Presence Index, and there's 3 dimensions: character, substance, and style. And this is where you have to listen to me talk for a minute, because I want to give you some definitions as to what each of these is. Now, I know this is going to be a new model for you, so I'm sorry if I go too fast or you're not able to absorb it. This information is all on our website. I can send you out the information afterwards. People find it's a kind of a useful tool just to think about these 3 dimensions, which each have 5 facets or behaviors. And this model altogether is based on all of these assessments we've done with executives, thousands of assessments. This is what we determined to be the model of effective leadership. So in the character, and I'm going to go through these again somewhat quickly, and then I'm going to open it up and get you to do some annotation here. But the first dimension, character, is really all about behaviors that build trust. These tend to be qualities or behaviors that are inherent in us as children, you know, that we begin with, that we grow with. And authenticity is all about being genuine, being transparent and open, sharing stories about yourself to connect with others. Integrity has kind of 2 parts of it. There's the moral integrity, which is, do you hold yourself to a higher value standard? But then the behavioral integrity, which can sometimes trip up leaders, is all about, are you following through on your commitments? Are you doing what people expect you to do? Concern is about creating a culture where it's obvious that you care about those around you, that you're supporting their development, that they feel comfortable and open. Restraint is kind of your temperament on a day-to-day basis. How well are you able to manage your emotions for you and the team around you? Are you able to be pretty even-keeled? Humility is about the ability to step back, to make room for others. It's kind of this idea of, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room. I want to make sure others have a chance to voice their ideas and opinions. So that's character. Again, that's all about building trust. So then you move into substance, which, if a character is about trust, this is about establishing credibility. These tend to be things that we really work on or evolve through our adult lives, so through our professional careers. And the first one, practical wisdom, a little bit about technical knowledge and subject matter expertise, but it's more about how you take the experiences that you've gained over your life and be able to really get to the heart of a matter. So how do you distill information so that your audience is hearing what matters most to them? Confidence is probably the one that's most misunderstood on our model, because a lot of folks interpret it as, well, self-confidence, you know, how confident am I in my own abilities? But remember, this model really is measuring perceptions of others. So this is about, how do others view you in terms of, are you able to make decisions? Are you accountable? Are you willing to take risks? Composure, related to restraint on the character dimension, but composure is situational. So that idea of, when you hit crisis, how are you with managing your emotion? That stay calm, spread calm mentality. We sometimes see leaders who are fantastic at restraint, but composure off the charts. They hit crisis and the wheels come off. Resonance is probably my favorite facet on this model. It's really about paying attention to the cues of folks around you. And some of you had raised, you know, this idea of being in a virtual environment. It's totally different. It's much harder to develop resonance when you're not sitting in the room across from someone, able to pay attention to their body language. You have to work a bit harder in a virtual environment to do that. So resonance is not just about being able to kind of notice how people are thinking and feeling, but it's acknowledging that. Like, do they know that you're noticing maybe they're not on board, and are you stopping, slowing down, and addressing it? Vision is kind of what you would traditionally expect. Can we have a view, a strategic view of what's possible? But the big part that leaders often miss about vision is, it has to be inspiring. If you have an idea of where you're trying to take the company and people are thinking, it falls kind of flat, blah, not interested, they're not going to follow you, they're not going to be motivated, and you're not going to get the most out of the team. So vision has to not just be kind of that collective view of what's possible, it has to be really inspirational for the team. All right, so on to the last one. Hang in there, I'm almost through these. So the third dimension is style, and that nomenclature can be a little misleading. It is more about demeanor. And so we've got trust, we've got credibility. Style is all about how you're driving execution through others. So how are you rallying them to get things done? Appearance, again, this is a tricky one. There is an element of the image or professional polish that comes with executive presence, but this facet is really more about your energy level and your preparedness. How well organized are you? Are you coming to the table, and are folks really wanting to follow you? The next three, the 3 I's, I'll go through these quickly. Intentionality is, we call it vision with a small v. So it's great if you've got a vision and everyone's kind of on board. Intentionality is, how do you organize folks, provide clarity of role, and make sure everyone knows exactly how they're going to execute the plan so they're off and running. Inclusiveness is about creating an environment where you're not just bringing the right people to the table, all the people to the table, you are actively soliciting their views. You're making sure all the voices are heard and all the voices are represented. Interactivity is about two-way dialogue. So not just are you able to have conversations, but are you setting up the things as a leader to give the right cadence, the right forums for people to be able to have a conversation and a share of ideas. And finally, assertiveness. So this is, it's certainly, you know, having an opinion, being vocal, but the big part of assertiveness is not just being vocal, it's, are you able to manage constructive conflict? So there are times where it's actually quite healthy to bring dissenting views to the table, and a really effective leader is able to kind of bring both sides, facilitate that conversation, and then help resolve it and move forward so that folks can leave the room feeling like their views were aired, but nothing has gotten stuck in the mud. So now that you've listened to me, and you probably don't remember the first thing that I said on authenticity because there was such an overload of information there, I am going to ask you to do a little annotation. So I would love for you to take a stab at pulling down your annotation bar, and we're going to start with the star stamp. And I would like you to put a star stamp on the qualities that you think are most important in this environment we're currently in. So in this time of extended change and crisis, what do you think leaders most need to demonstrate? And if you have any trouble, Kristen can come on and show us. Oh, we've got some folks weighing in. Awesome. All right. We've got a good mix of things here. Authenticity, concern, confidence, inclusiveness, humility, vision. This is great. All right, so it looks like we've got a lot of votes for authenticity, a lot of votes for composure. But yeah, you know, the thing about this model is it would be great if we could all convey all of these behaviors all the time. But there are certainly some that tend to show up more during particular times like crisis than others. Awesome job using the annotation. Well done. All right, so now I'm gonna make you switch it up and have you go to the X stamp. So same annotation bar. There will be a red X. Now put an X next to the ones that you think leaders are most challenged by right now. And this could be based on things that you've even seen in your own organization. You know, what are leaders maybe not doing as well as you would like to see them doing? There's some X's. All right. And feel free as you're weighing in to also drop in the chat, you know, what are you seeing in your own companies? If you're willing to comment on some of what you're marking up here, this is obviously all anonymous, but if you want to weigh in and talk about which character or which trait you're seeing is most challenged and why, or on the other side, what behavior you're seeing is really important and why, I'd love to get some voices in the mix as well. You can either potentially come off mute and share your ideas, or you can drop it into the chat. So why are you selecting some of the ones that you are? Obviously vision seems to be high in where leaders might be lacking. Inclusiveness. Anyone wanna, and I can't, Kristen, unfortunately I can't see if folks raise their hand on the toolbar, so if anyone does that, please let me know. Oh, Michael raised his hand. All right.
Thank you, Laura. One thing here, there's one thing missing that I don't see here and I think is important, and I'm just curious whether it was ever in there, and that's consistency. That sense that what you hear from a leader and what a leader does today is not going to change a week from now and then again a month from now. Because when you talk about how leaders are viewed by their people, I will say that's something in my long career I have seen that undermines leaders incredibly and really saps people's willingness to commit when they think, okay, this is great, but 2 weeks from now, he or she is going to be on something else. So that's kind of a question.
That's an excellent point. And I would say there's probably elements of that in both restraint and integrity, in terms of integrity being, you're going to follow through on what we're expecting you to follow through. And there's kind of a required consistency that comes with that. Restraint is you're pretty even keeled. Like folks will know that you're not going to totally shift gears, but to play the devil's advocate, I would say there's this element of, particularly in this environment we're in, I think we've seen a lot of leaders have failed because they haven't adapted, right? Sometimes the consistency can be overrated. And I know you're talking about some specific examples where they need to stick with their vision and execute on it. Is that right?
Yeah, and again, I subscribe to the when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? No one's questioning that. You shouldn't stick to something.
Yeah.
Through hell and high water and go under with it. But frankly, I've seen much more. If I look at the leaders that I have worked for, been part of companies or whatever, I've seen a lot more where, from the perception of the people who work for them, what really kills them is like, okay, yeah, great. Last year it was this, now it's that. I really can't get excited. And they keep their heads down until it goes away because they know it will. So that's why I raised that one.
Yeah, it's a great point. The other thing I would say that we see a lot from leaders is there may be a very rational or logical reason why they are changing, but they aren't being transparent about it. They're not explaining the rationale behind, okay, I know we agreed to this, I have to shift gears. I'm going to explain to you the background, the context of that decision. And I think leaders often skip over that. So it feels like I've missed something, there's a gap here. So I think your point is incredibly valid and shows up probably underlying here, but it's an important one for sure that leaders need to think about. That's great. Thanks, Michael. All right. Any other comments before we kind of move on? Thank you everyone for weighing in. It looks like we definitely have some areas where perhaps from personal experience or otherwise, you've noticed that folks are challenged. So what does the data tell us? So, obviously Bates has a little bit of a research base here. And so we actually have pulled together what are the behaviors that leaders most need to demonstrate during crisis. So, and sorry, Kristen, could you clear for me? Thank you. All right, so the qualities that matter most during crisis based on what we've seen. And I'm going to go through these and just talk a little bit about them. So composure, a lot of you did mark composure as one of those that you think is most critical. And so, this really reflects the ability to be steady during crisis. So what do you do? And I think one of the things hopefully you've seen, and this links a little bit to another facet, is the ability to be real about the crisis and to slow down and don't downplay the magnitude of it. And I think one of the challenges when you're in this extended environment is that it compounds. And a lot of leaders may have been inclined to be out in front and maybe connect a bit more. And then that trailed off because I figured everyone just kind of settled in and we're all used to this environment. But there's this compound effect of, actually the more you work in a virtual environment, the more you're on exhausting video calls, the more you're trying to balance the work-life situation, the more you need to be witnessing kind of a steady hand and communication from your leader. So composure is one that came up as a necessary in this time of change. Interactivity related. So you need to actually create a forum where folks can have some dialogue. And one of the keys that jumps out here is kind of the predictability factor. And employees really need to know that there can be some set expectations as to when and how they're going to hear from leaders. So some of that, you can take for granted. We've got town hall meetings or you've got a one-on-one, but making sure that you're communicating, there's transparency about when and how they're going to be able to get in touch with leaders is a big part of what they're looking for during crisis. Resonance. So again, this is the ability, it's hard on video. I mentioned that earlier, is when you're sitting across the table from someone and, they're giving you this, clearly they're not on board. Or, if they're kind of looking off and disengaged, you can see that. On video, you really have to work hard at it. And so one of the things, you can do is, and this gets a little bit to the virtual presence, which we can spend more time on later, is, making eye contact with your camera can feel incredibly awkward because it does not always allow you to look down at folks who are on the screen, particularly when you've got kind of the Brady Bunch approach there. But look at the camera as much as you can, because that does kind of create the eye contact that folks are used to connect. But then it's okay to back up and do a scan the way you would if you were in a room looking around the table and see what you're getting in terms of nonverbal cues. That's where resonance comes in. So really important that leaders not just kind of stay calm, create the room for conversation, but that they're checking in with folks and can see what's happening there. Inclusiveness, making sure that there's the ability for folks to have their opinions raised, that they feel like they have a voice. So much about this environment has been things that we can't control, and that can create a real sense of anxiety. So giving them a chance to control some element of it, even if it is, I need you to understand where I am and what I'm feeling, and I need to give you my views and ideas, that goes a long way to helping to create that element of control that everybody needs to have a little bit of. And the last one, authenticity. So we did talk about this. You know, some of the best things I've seen are leaders that you wouldn't even expect, you know, from very high profile companies, giving you a little peek under the hood. What's it like for them, you know, with toddlers running around, or, you know, pets in the background, or trying to balance running a, you know, a Fortune 500 company with kind of the real life stuff that we all deal with. Authenticity can go an incredibly long way in terms of helping you stay connected to folks in your organizations or your peers as well. So those are the ones that showed up as most critical during crisis. So let's talk a little bit about, well, which ones in practicality are most absent with leaders. And so I'm going to have you take a stab at putting a X next to the ones that you think are most likely to not show up for leaders. I know you already kind of touched on which ones you think are challenging, but which ones, now that you know the ones that really truly are seen as critical, which ones do you think leaders tend to fail on most? All right, so inclusiveness, authenticity, interactivity. Okay, so we did a look, and hang on to the annotations, Kristen. Okay, so now here are the ones that the bottom 6 facets that show up of the 15. The bottom 6 are inclusiveness, restraint, resonance, assertiveness, vision, and composure. So of those, what do we notice? What do you see between the ones that are most critical and the ones that are most absent? See any overlap here? So that's a problem, right? If the behaviors that we're hearing from folks that they need to see most in their leaders are in at least several cases, the ones that are least likely to show up: composure, resonance, and inclusiveness. Really, this is about awareness, right? So there may be times where this is a challenge for all of us, but we need to be conscious of what triggers certain behaviors for us, and what is most necessary for our teams, and then we can figure out how to better show up. So I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction here. Kristen, if you want to clear the annotations, let's look at a cut of the data that gives us a slightly different view. So gender, does gender influence leadership style? So we looked at kind of the data behind kind of the broad population, if you will, but do you think there are nuances in how leaders show up, how men and women may differ a little bit in this leadership style? Let's take a look. So what behaviors, and this is, again, I'll have you go ahead and use your stars here. What behaviors do you think show up most strongly for women? All right, so we've got authenticity, we've got inclusiveness, practical wisdom, concern. Excellent. All right, so that's great. And if we compare it to those traits that we said are most critical during crisis, let's see how we stack up. Let's see, did I get all of them? I believe I did. All right, so I think you guys are really attuned to what is happening, you know, so concern, obviously inclusiveness. So it's, you know, it's great. We see it's some of those critical behaviors that we know are important during crisis show up for women. What about for men? So what do you think, any facets that men might show up more strongly during times of crisis when you look at this model? And so maybe use a different stamp if you need to kind of distinguish, because I think we've got some stars and X's in there. You can maybe use a heart or whatever other stamp you have out there. Oh, good. Some green check marks. Okay, confidence. A heart. I love it. Okay, a lot of votes for confidence. Cool. Assertiveness. Excellent. All right, so here's what may be a little surprising for you. Men get rated significantly higher in only one facet that shows up the most during crisis. And it is one that nobody has actually chosen. It is restraint. So the important thing to remember here is this is about perception, right? So it could be in certain instances that, you know, men are more likely to engage in behaviors that make them seem deliberate or really calm or proactive. But it could also be that, you know, men and women are engaging in the same type of behavior and it's just being perceived differently. But I don't point this out to say that either of these is true of all women or true of all men, but it's really to emphasize two key points. One is that it is critical to demonstrate emotional intelligence in the workplace. So, you know, you see some of these facets, some of these behaviors that we're talking about. And a lot of times, you know, as we move up kind of the corporate ladder or into more senior roles, a lot of that is based on our technical knowledge, right? You continue to get promoted and to grow into greater areas of responsibility because you know your stuff. And that eventually becomes kind of a baseline. That's an expected you know, asset that you have. But oftentimes we don't always get the development or the support around what I would consider some of those softer qualities. So some of these other behaviors that actually show up as being most critical during crisis aren't ones that we are given a ton of guidance all the time to develop. So emotional intelligence is really important. And that leads to the second point. So it's really critical to ensure that you have diversity of thought, of opinions, of experiences, of style, whether it's men, women. I'm talking diversity much more broadly than gender. This is the importance of having folks who have different strengths in these areas come to the table is going to be the difference, not just because it's, you know, the right thing to do. It really matters to the bottom line. So let's just talk about that for a quick minute. And Kristen, if you want to go ahead and clear the annotations. Well, oh, there's our restraint. I forgot to put it up. All right, so diversity does matter to the bottom line, and this is likely not something any of you don't know, but you know, companies that are well diversified tend to perform better financially. And so just to carry on that idea of the gender diversity that I talked about before, so there's been a ton of research and studies around this, and I'm just going to cite a couple of them. There was a study that was done that looked at Fortune 500 companies, and at the companies that had the highest representation of women on the boards were able to attain higher financial performance on average, more so than non-diverse boards. There was another study that was done, and this one was really global. It looked at kind of, I think it was like 2,000 companies across 50 different countries, and the top 20% of companies when measuring financial performance, the top 20% of high-performing companies had over 25% of the women were leaders. So, you know, again, there's still room to go, but this does emphasize it matters to the bottom line. But beyond financial performance, how else do you think it matters? And so maybe drop into the chat box here. Why else does diversity matter to business? Examples that you might be able to come up with as how it drives kind of a better outcome. Any thoughts in there? Well, I'll talk about two while perhaps you're putting some ideas in the chat. So engaging younger talent. So if you think about leaders who are high in some of those qualities we talked about, such as concern or, you know, interactivity, they're more likely to demonstrate interest and development and connect with some of these younger generations, with the millennials who really need a very different style and approach. So it's kind of that flexibility, that interactivity that is going to actually help mobilize parts of your organization that the prior models maybe didn't work for. Another big area is innovation, and that's huge. So there's been a lot of studies that have been done. We've done some of this work at Bates as well, that the most diverse companies tend to develop the most new products and to bring the most radical new innovations into the marketplace, was how I saw it phrased in one study. So better decision making, Sean, it sounds like MIT did do a study on that. It helps avoid groupthink. More family friendly. I mean, there's so many benefits to considering diversity. And so I want to leave you with this quote before we move on from an article that was in the Harvard Business Review, which I think is great. It says, if you narrow the backgrounds, experiences, and outlooks of the people on your team, you are limiting the number of solution spaces that can be explored. At best, you'll come up with fewer ideas, and at worst, you run the risk of creating an echo chamber with inherent biases, where inherent biases are normalized and groupthink sets in. So 100%, Ted, I think you hit on that. It says avoid groupthink. That's not good for anyone, for the company or for the individual. All right, so the key takeaway here is having a diverse team is crucial for driving innovation. It's crucial for driving growth and for overall performance. But having a diverse team can also help balance some of those behaviors, those facets that we talked about. If you have leaders with different strengths coming to the table, it's going to help support that. But even with a diverse team, there may be instances where you need to amplify your strengths, but you may also be challenged. Like if some of those behaviors we talked about that are really critical during times of crisis, what do you do if those are not an area of strength for you? So I'm going to talk through a couple of tools that I think hopefully will be pretty straightforward, but might be helpful as you think about your own development or some of the leaders you work with. And maybe you can, casually slide this in front of their desk if there are particular facets that they are struggling with. All right, so let's start with the ABCD model. And I'm curious if anyone is familiar with this. You may have seen this or heard this used before. This is a very simple mental model, but I would say some of the best tools that we can have at our disposal are ones that are easy to remember, that we can replicate consistently. So this is all about 4 or 5 steps. The A is for ask. So these are really during times where you feel like your inclination is to react, is to go. You're going to respond, and you may have a heated idea about how you're going to respond. So stop and ask a question. Force yourself to ask 1 or 2 questions. Of course, you don't want it to be an accusatory question like, well, what the heck are you thinking? But more a clarifying question. Tell me more about, how you got to that decision. It buys you some time. That goes to breathe. So, sometimes we do shoot from the hip. So what do? You stop and you breathe. You take a few seconds, and it may feel like an eternity to you, but even just taking 5 seconds to collect your thoughts, to calm the inner voices, it can make a big difference in coming up with a thoughtful, constructive response. Count. For any of you who have had young children or have children at home, this may be something you find yourself using constantly of, I need to, before I lose my temper, I'm going to count to 10, and they know what happens when mom starts counting, but it does. It's the same idea of it's giving you a little space to stop, pause, and just force yourself to be in the moment. The last one is drink. And yes, I don't mean alcohol in the sense. There may be times where you need something a little bit stronger to get you through the situation. But this is take a sip of water, take a sip of tea. Just create some distraction to collect your thoughts again. You can also use defer as the D here. And that is, there are going to be instances where you do all of these things and you're still not ready with a response. And it's okay to say before, it's better to say, listen, I need to follow up with you. I need to think that over. Let's catch up a little bit after this meeting and regroup on it. It's better to do that than to respond in the moment. So with that, I'm gonna, so this model is really about creating more time between what happens and how you respond. So each one of those A, B, C, D items just give you a chance to create a thoughtful response. And to put it another way, the goal here is really to strive for a deliberate response, not a default reaction. So again, think about what those triggers might be and how you might be able to calm yourself to be able to respond appropriately. So I think on this one, I was going to ask you to weigh in on which behaviors you thought it would most support, but I've already given them to you. So I've cheated for you. But as you probably are not surprised, composure and restraint, that ABCD model really will help you both in the day-to-day if you feel yourself, oh, I'm getting a little off keel here, or composure in a time of crisis. Try to use that model and it will help you perhaps settle things. So let me go into another model here. This is the head, hearts, hand model. And I talked to someone the other day who said they actually had used this model, or someone had used this model at their kids' daycare. And I thought, okay, well, that it works in corporate environments as well as the daycare setting. So take with that what you may. But so this is really about the idea of using questions to get at the root of the thoughts, emotions, and actions that are important or necessary for your audience. So when you think about the head, this is starting to understand their thought process. So you can do this by asking some questions about, what they may be thinking. So, and we have a template that I can send anyone who's interested in kind of the full list of questions. But for example, how did you get to your opinion on that? Or what problem are you trying to solve? So rather than going in and kind of discounting or saying, well, I'm going to go in a different direction here, this gets a little bit to what we were talking about is when you need to explain the rationale behind an idea, sometimes it's better to do some info gathering first. So what ideas come to mind for you as we might try to solve this problem? So start with trying to understand their mindset, and then you move on to their motivation. How might they be feeling? So you can do this also through questions and really think about, getting to what their motivation, their internal motivation might be. What's your gut reaction to this plan? Or does this decision feel right to you? Now, going back to this idea, we're in a virtual environment, we're on video a lot. Sometimes you might need to do a process observation that we call. So you may just notice some of those nonverbal cues. So it's okay to say, listen, I'm just reading your body language here a little bit. It looks like you may be a little bit confused about what we're talking about, or that you may be a little concerned about the direction we're going. Can you tell me what you're thinking or feeling? So now you've kind of said, okay, I've gotten into your mindset. I've understood where you are. I want to know how you're feeling, the heart. Now let's talk about what we're going to do about this. And this is where you get into hands, which is about action. And you're asking questions to really clarify what you do to move forward. So tell me what you think the next step should be. How do you see your role in this, and how do you see my role in this? So often there's gaps in all of this that can derail leaders, before moving forward. So it gives you a chance to take a fresh look at your stakeholders and really use some questions to uncover where they might be. So let's, and I love that I keep seeing some stars and checks and hearts pop up, because now I want you to use them again. Tell me what behaviors or facets, if you were to use that head, heart, hands model of asking questions, what facets here do you think that would support? So if you're a leader who's challenged in one of these facets, where do you think you might use head, heart, hands if you struggled with which of these? Yeah, you guys are right on. All right, so let's look at some of these. Interactivity, that's two-way dialogue. So that's, you're expressing the curiosity and interest in what they're saying and what they're thinking. Then you get inclusiveness, for sure. We've got a couple folks who are there. So you're asking them, you're making room for their ideas and their perspectives. That's where you get inclusiveness. You also get humility there. If you're paying attention to how they're feeling about a situation, that's helping you strengthen your resonance. And then if you're coming to some agreement, intentionality, remember that was vision with a small v, that's all about, okay, we're going to have a clear plan coming out of this. So if you think going into a conversation, you already know the direction you're going to go, you're not slowing down, you're just going to charge forward, which in this environment, a lot of leaders are feeling like they have to do. It's fast paced. I've just got to make decisions. People are looking to me. But if you just take the time to stop, ask some questions of your audience, you're going to get to a better outcome, and they're going to feel more connected to it. So now I'm going to share with you, and Kristen, if you want to clear the annotations for me, that would be great. Awesome, thank you. All right, so I'm going to share with you a tool that, and bear with me, we're going to wrap up here and I'll take some questions, but this is one of those tools that we use with virtually every client, and it is the most, if you thought the other tools were straightforward, this is really straightforward, but I would say this is probably the most impactful tool that folks use. It can change the way you think about things. So the audience agenda, and some of you may have used this as well, but it's a pretty simple tool. Here it is. There's a page and there's a line down the middle of the page. And so essentially what you do here is on the left-hand side of the page, this is where you can use this in advance of a meeting, a presentation that you're doing, any interaction, conversation that you're looking to have. And you write down what are the points that you need to get across. This is your agenda on the left-hand side. So think about a conversation you've got coming up. What do you need to get across? What decisions do you need to have made? What is the most important info for you to be able to get across? I'm going to share a real life example. So we met with a hospital association here in New England, and they were trying to think about how their hospital leaders and administrators should interact with some of their frontline folks. And so this will help illustrate it a little bit. So the topic was COVID, not surprisingly. The audience was the practitioners, the frontline. And this is where they jotted down what the audience needed to know. So, and again, this is, from a month or two ago. So, but these ideas are things that you're not surprised by, I'm sure. Hospital leaders were thinking, we got to share with them what's happening, an update, and how we're staying on top of the information, and what we think is going to happen next. So really great topics and ideas, but are they the right ones? Are they the most relevant ones? So then after you kind of get through that, you literally turn your view and you step into the shoes of your audience. So think about who you're speaking to in any of these instances. And in this case, it was the practitioners, right? Frontline. So then you start to jot down what is most important to them. And they were concerned about, well, what's happening with budget cuts, and how can you cut things now? And, I don't know if we have all the right protocols, and I'm worried about my own health and well-being, and where are we going to get the materials and resources? Very real emotional things that they were struggling with, right? So if you look at these two sides of the page, what do you notice? Feel free to drop it into chat. What do you notice about these two agendas? In sync? Not so much, right? So pretty opposite sides of the coin, related, but pretty different. So what do you do in that situation? Well, let me get back through that. This is what you do. So we like to say, if you're not on the right side, if you're on the left side of the page, you're not on the right side of the page. Sorry, I messed that one up, but you get the idea. It's really about starting with your audience agenda. You have to craft your comments, your views, starting with what they care about. Because if you don't start from a place that they care about, there's going to be resistance, and you won't be able to get them to listen or engage. So obviously you have points you always need to get across in a conversation, right? It's just the idea of not starting there. You'll naturally get there, but start with what they need. So often when we go into a conversation or a presentation, we start by thinking about what we need to get across, and rather you can change the dialogue by starting with what is on their mind. So I'll give you, let's see, what behaviors do you think this would help? If you were to use the audience agenda, where do you think this might lift some of your impact? Authenticity, integrity, great. Inclusiveness, right. Resonance. I think you guys are getting the hang of this model. Awesome. All right, so inclusiveness for sure. That's considering other viewpoints. You're really stepping into someone else's shoes, which is particularly important. Resonance, you are, again, being attuned to what's on their minds, what they're feeling and thinking. And practical wisdom, which you remember, this isn't about being the subject matter expertise. It's about how can you land on the heart of what is going to matter most to the audience. And that's where audience agenda can really help you. Certainly these others, it has lift in so many of the behaviors. Try it out, just get a page before your next big conversation, jot down, always start with your agenda first, because it does show kind of how it compares to their agenda, but give it a shot. And Kristen, if you're still there, if you could clear the annotation. So what happens when you've only got like 10 minutes and you've got this conversation coming up that you need to prepare for, or you know you're going to have a tough Q&A at the end of a session, what do? This is the 10-minute version of audience agendas to some degree. And what you do is you write down the top 3 questions that you don't want to answer. So start with the things that you're dreading and really think about, those are, who's going to be the biggest skeptic in the room? Write down those questions. And then you write down the answers. And then you practice it as much as you can. Just try to have a little dialogue. And when you write it down, you're not scripting it. You're writing a couple bullet points. If you do nothing else before you go into every meeting, given how back-to-back our schedules are these days, try this and just start with that. So it's the idea of saying, listen, I know there's some things on your mind. Let me just tackle those for you first. And then let's think about how we can, move into a really constructive dialogue about how we're going to work on this together. So that's the quick prep method. Where do you think some of that is going to play into these behaviors again? All right. There's a lot. I mean, using the whole idea of just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, being prepared and organized, it has a lot of lift in these areas. So appearance actually is one. Remember, this is about being well organized, demonstrating that you've put some thought into things. And if there is one theme I hear from leaders these days, it's, I don't even have room in my schedule. Whereas we used to, when we were in the office, you're walking from one meeting to the next, you've got a chance to grab a cup of coffee just to have a mental moment to reflect on things. That is not happening. I don't know about you, but it is back to back to back. You don't have a breather in between your conversations. Having that even 10 minutes, and I encourage folks as much as you can, try to schedule 45-minute meetings. And so I know one company, one large investment company, they will only schedule 45-minute meetings during this period of time. They've said, listen, we need 15 minutes for people to have a break in between. Otherwise, you will go through that video, Zoom fatigue, as it's called. And I'm sure you've experienced that. So appearance is about spending a little time to reflect and prepare. Assertiveness is important. Let's see if resonance, practical wisdom, authenticity, and assertiveness. Yeah, so assertiveness is important because it's about you're mitigating some of that potential conflict. You're getting ahead of it. And then practical wisdom is, again, getting to the heart of it. So you guys definitely hit on some of those. All right, and I'll leave you with this quote, and I'm sorry that the image is blurry, but I think it was Robert Frost who said the only way round is through. And so, the overall theme of some of those tools that I shared with you is really about finding your calm. It's about spreading it. It's about connecting with your audience in a meaningful way. And these things don't always come naturally. So you do have to kind of put the time in and practice it. And we know this environment's not going away anytime soon. So we're going to have to go through it, right? But it's an opportunity for us as leaders to really think about, okay, where are my strengths? What can I amplify? What do I just need to be conscious of in terms of triggers? And how can I practice some of those things? So try out some of these tools. Don't underestimate how much your employees or your peers or even your leaders are looking to you to help create some of this calm in the eye of the storm. And right now it's starting to rain really hard here. So I literally feel like I'm in the eye of the storm to some degree. So hopefully my connection doesn't go out. But, executive presence does matter. And these little tips and tools that I've given you, they are ways to just help demonstrate that you are aligning the folks on your team, that you're inspiring them, and that you're motivating them to act. So I'm going to pause there. I think I probably went too long, but I think we have a couple minutes for questions. And I know some folks had raised, virtual presence tips or, how to engage. So, anything's fair game, and I'm happy to follow up and share some tools with the CFA Society that can be available to you after the session. So, Sean, maybe I will turn it over to you. I'll come off sharing and see if anyone has any questions.
Laura, while people are thinking about their questions, I have a question, which is, I like that 45-minute meeting idea. Are there any other kind of anecdotes that you have from, organizations that are really leading and being thoughtful that you could share? Yeah,
there's a couple. So one is use video judiciously. So I am a big proponent, as much as I've talked about video fatigue. When you cannot be in person, it can really make a difference to do video, but you've got to use it sparingly. You can't expect employees to be on video for 8 hours. You will lose their engagement, and you just won't. They won't be they won't be feeling the balance that you need them to have. So think about the criteria for needing to have that. If it's a big group, you don't need it necessarily. If it's just a business update, you don't need it. If it is a one-on-one, or if you're trying to do a check-in with someone to really kind of gauge how are they emotionally feeling, or talk through something that may be tough, that's when you do video. But be really clear with folks about, we're going to use this sometimes, but it's also okay to go off video. If we have a video meeting, take yourself off. Allow them a chance to stand, to stretch up. The other thing that we suggest is it's still okay to do walking meetings. That idea of sometimes maybe we were in the office, you would get up and, catch up with someone about a project, walking around the block or something. Still do that. Wear your mask, but you can still take a walk and do an audio call with someone. Just even the process of standing up, moving a little bit in a conversation will help give you that energy break. So there are things that you just have to do differently in this environment, but most of all, go easy on yourself, go easy on your employees. Because it really, this is what, if we're here for the long haul, this is what is going to determine what kind of employees they want to be and how they stick with you in the future.
Laura, there's a question that came in the chat from Ted, which I think he probably, like me, was pretty impressed by the sophisticated way that you use Zoom during this presentation. Are there any other Zoom tips that you have to share with us?
Yeah, there's so many. I'll give you real quick a couple of things. So we use Zoom a lot for platforms and programs that we do. Use all the tools that Zoom has available. So we do a lot of breakout sessions. So if you've got a big meeting like this, and if we have more time, I would definitely have tried this out with you. But you can, populate small breakout rooms from 2 people to, groups of 5 or 6. It's a great way to kind of replicate that, small group environment discussions. Get people who are not going to be inclined to weigh in a session like this. They're not going to speak up when there's 40 people on the line, but get them into a group of 4 or 5 people, have them brainstorm. You can throw up a whiteboard on Zoom and actually document some of your ideas. It's literally like the whiteboard you might have in your office. You can save it down and have all the notes, bring that back for discussion. So use that, use polls when or even the chat box as we've done here. It's really important to get folks talking, weighing, and engaged. Otherwise, it's very easy for them to disconnect. The last thing I'll say is, there's a link on our website for this acronym field, and it's just literally about how do you fit in a frame to have a good image. So the acronym field stands for frame. So when you are in your video frame, you really only want about 1 inch of room between your head and the top. So you want to be centered. You want to be the focus of the frame for your audience. So it's easy for them to really focus on you. The I is for image, and that's pay attention to what's in your background. So virtual backgrounds can be good. They can have you can see like some of my fingers are disappearing if you move the wrong way. But be conscious of how distracting your background is. If you have a distracting background, use a virtual image if it's approved by your company. If not, just make sure it's at least tidy behind you. I've seen some really awful backgrounds, and it just takes away from the conversation you're having. The E is for eye contact. So you want to make sure you're elevated at eye level with your camera. That may mean you need to adjust your screen or your chair. I sit on a pillow because mine didn't adjust, so I stole some pillows out of my daughter's room, and that boosts me up. So at least there's this feeling of eye contact that I can keep with you. L is about light. So it is really important that you have light on your face and not just coming from behind. If you've ever been in a meeting with someone who's sitting in front of a window, it looks like witness protection program stuff, right? They're a total silhouette, and you can't really gauge facial expressions. And then the last is distance. And there is a hysterical SNL skit that was done about this, where you've got people who are like pressed up against the camera because they can't quite figure out how close am I supposed to be, or how far away am I supposed to be. You want to go back to that idea of the frame, where you want to be centered and you want to have just a little bit of headroom, but you don't want to be too close, and you don't want to be at the end of a long boardroom table either, because you'll lose that connection. So I know we're a couple minutes over, so hopefully those were useful tips, but there's an article on the batescommunication.com website that you can check out, and it gives you all of those tips as well.
Well, this has been fantastic, Laura. Thank you very much. Oh, let's see. Michael says, oh, he didn't expect a 15-minute gap. But this has been awesome. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us. We really enjoyed it, and hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.